Welcome back to Performance Process, everybody. I'm Caleb Fretz.
And I'm Ronan. We won. The Europeans process. We won.
You did take a resounding victory. Congratulations on that. Until I forget halfway through this episode and we go right back. Today's episode of Performance Process, it's the first in a series, actually. The series is called Aero 101. And it's all about aero testing, really. And we're going to have a couple different episodes on this. They're not necessarily going to be sequential, like next week is going to be something else, but we will have a pile of episodes on this. The first one here is all about essentially DIY aero testing. What exactly does that mean, Ronan?
We spoke to Marc Graveline, who is, he was one of the founders and inventors of the Notio aerometer a few years back now. He's also like a World Tour aero consultant for some World Tour teams. And we were discussing basically all the ins and outs of what you need to know if you want to go doing aero testing at home. So we talked about, first of all, the sort of complexity around it and the sort of how to overcome that barrier. We looked at how to figure out the perfect venue, how to find a venue, sort of the testing protocols you should follow. And then, looking into just sort of managing expectations that, how many things can you test in one day? How should you start day one? What should you be testing? And everything around that. And then sort of just everything that goes into sort of analyzing your results and having confidence in first of all, confidence in the results that you're getting, but also how to achieve that confidence in terms of how many runs you should do and how to ensure that the data is reliable. So pretty lengthy conversation, this one, but I think it's fascinating throughout.
I mean, it's a complicated topic because essentially what we're talking about here is taking a wind tunnel and putting it in your backyard, right? Like going out and finding a stretch of road and riding it a whole bunch of times and controlling as many variables as possible and getting out of the end of it a CDA figure, a how aero are you number. It is a complicated process, but it's not an impossible process. And I think that was one of the big takeaways for me out of this conversation was, if you're willing to put in the time, you can go have a backyard wind tunnel, basically.
Not only can you do it, but it actually can be quite rewarding also. And Mark gave us a fascinating figure in terms of an average result that one of the testers that he has worked with in the past has achieved across, I can't remember how many tests, but quite a lot of tests. So yeah, the potential here is huge in terms of performance gains, and the cost can be as little as, financially nothing, obviously a heck of a lot of time investment required.
You need a couple things. You need a power meter. You need a couple pieces of equipment to make this work. There are also these sort of, stick out in front of your bike dongle aero thingies that are sort of floating around these days. I don't know if there are any sort of consumer facing ones, are there?
There is Aero Sensor, which is one that I've been using quite a bit. There's also...
Can you actually get those now?
You can. So those who invested in the Kickstarter for that have received their units, if I understand correctly. So those are available. Not sure where Notio is at. That's where Mark originally came from. Mark does have his own new Gizmo Aero Sensor. If I understand correctly, that's not commercially available. He mentions it a few times in this podcast, but it's effectively another one of those aero sensors. And then there are a few others that are close to reaching the market, but not there yet for a variety of different reasons. I feel like I've left one or two out.
So in this episode, we're going to go into a bit of the Chung method as well, which is a version of aero testing that doesn't require any of these sort of special devices. All you need is a power meter and a bike and a nice straight stretch of road, as well as talking about some of the sort of technical solutions, these device solutions that are coming either now or soon. The gist of it is, how do you get more aero optimized at home without booking wind tunnel time? In other words, how can you, in real life, go pick the best helmet and go find your ideal position and decide whether overshoes are right or wrong? And all these other questions that you can actually start to answer for yourself. So I think it's a fascinating conversation. And Ronan, I think we should just get right into it.
Yep, let's go. All right, Mark, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us again. Of course, listeners will recognize your voice from the podcast that we did during this year's Tour de France. But we're here today to discuss some of what came up during that podcast in a bit more detail, and that is aero testing. And I think we're effectively going to do like an aero testing 101. 101's quite maybe apt, because that could well end up being the number of episodes of this podcast we end up dedicating to aero testing. So that's the goal there, and we'll work towards that. But rather than sort of delving into specifics of one type of aero testing today, I think it would be useful to kickstart this conversation with an overview of everything you should be aware of and everything that is useful to know in terms of getting into aero testing. Set the scene here. What's the biggest gain that you have ever found from a single athlete with just aero testing alone?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There is a gentleman that I work with in Arizona. He's an aero tester. His name is Brian Stover. And because he uses the device that we test with, I get to see his reports. And recently I went through all his aero tests and I did an average, I think, of something like 32 tests. And his average was roughly 22 watts of savings. Now, keep in mind, he tests mostly age group athletes, triathletes, and cyclists. So very often they come in not perfectly optimized, but his average was around there, 22-ish, I think, watts. There was an episode on a podcast that I did recently, and we talked about Sylvan Adams' optimization for worlds. And he was close to that. He was somewhere around, 20 watts. However, I also work with a couple of World Tour riders, and when we bring them in for aero testing, it's, substantially less than that because they're pretty optimized to start with. So I think it depends a lot on your starting point. I don't think I've ever seen a rider that we didn't find watts, be it 5, 6, 8. Very, very, very rare. I'm sure if we tested Dan Bigham, it would be a little harder, but I think there's definitely
always an outlier.
there's definitely watts to gain by everybody, and this is both TT athletes, track athletes, and we see it as well on road cycling athletes. So it's not just a TT thing.
You've said there's definitely watts to gain. There's benefits to be had for aero testing, and I think everybody's sort of acutely aware of this at this point in time. But it's still not something we see many riders doing. I think that's fair to say. Can you give me, first of all, sort of why you think that might be?
The main reason is probably the complexity or the perceived complexity around aero testing. I think you have a large population of people that have tried it and didn't succeed. And you have another chunk of people that heard of the first chunk and then said, well, if he wasn't able to do it, I'm not going to be able to do it. And then there's probably a chunk of people that don't believe that they could gain that much from it. So they're very skeptical. They think the way to get aero-optimized is to post some pictures on a Facebook page and take people's input, and they'll be optimized that way. So I think there's probably three people in all three camps, and there's the people that just don't care. They do it for fun, and they're not competitive. But I'd say overall, I think the complexity of aero testing, or the perceived complexity, is probably what holds a lot of people back.
Okay, and with that in mind, do you have a rough idea of how many aero tests you've done in your career, or any kind of rough idea?
Oh, well, first of all, every ride that I do is an aero test, because I spend a lot of time testing the devices that we make on myself. So put it this way, I've analyzed definitely over 1,000 tests, definitely, easily.
Okay, so probably safe to assume then you've sort of figured out a way to streamline and simplify aero testing.
So there are, I'd say, two categories of products for testing on the road. So, we can talk about tunnel testing and velodrome testing and road testing. But on the road testing side, there's two categories. There's first category, which are software only products. And then there's a second category, which, is a combination of hardware, software. There's probably, I don't know, between the two, 10 products out there. I've used every single one of them, some of the hardware products, I physically didn't get the hardware, but I've analyzed files from people that do have the hardware. So I'd say that, I've worked with pretty well everything that's out there. So, we can talk to them one by one on the pros and the cons. And,
almost every bike on my club run tomorrow morning will have a power meter on it, in 2023. Will we ever get to that point with aero testing, and how do we get there? That's a huge question, but I think it'll set the scene for the rest of the podcast.
Okay, so let's back up and consider, I think it was about 2008-ish. There was a paper put out by a guy named Jim Martin and Andy Kogan, and they published a mathematical model that showed the relationship between power, speed, wind, altitude change, environmental conditions, rolling resistance, and weight. So, if you take those, I guess it's about 6 or 7 things. They had a mathematical formula that put them all in relation. And if you take that formula and you're able to measure all of those things, so power, speed, that's easy, power meter, GPS or a speed sensor, wind is a little tougher, altitude is a little tougher, air density. If you can measure all those things, you could actually calculate a CDA. Okay. The problem is it's measuring all those things is a lot tougher than it seems. So what happens is, since a lot of people have had really ingenious ideas on how, if you don't have one, let's say you don't have an accurate inclination / altitude, how could you do testing without that variable? Or, if you can't properly measure acceleration, for example, which is related to speed, well, just do the tests at a constant speed. If you can't measure inclination, just do it on a flat road. So all these different products kind of found ingenious ways of testing, imposing some conditions and protocols, but to get around, the things that they could not measure. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Let's sort of take this from the perspective of okay, well, let's take me. How about that? I'm sitting here. I have a power meter on my bike, on my road bike. I have a good stretch of road that I think might be a good location to ride back and forth a whole bunch of times. What else does my bike need to make this happen? What else do I need to be thinking about? And like, what's step one? Let's just walk people through this maybe.
So step one is, to understand, if you understand the venue that you have, okay, and you understand the conditions in which you're going to be able to test, you're going to figure out what is a good software or hardware product for you, and what is a good test protocol for you. So in there, we talked about, there's 7 parameters like wind and altitude change. If you're in an environment where the wind is very constant or there's no wind, that makes things a lot easier. If you have a road which is perfectly flat, that makes things easier. If no traffic, that makes things easier. So, the first thing to do is to understand, what are your constraints, and then try to pick the right tool based on your constraints.
Sorry, folks, that's all for this free version of the Performance Process podcast. If you want to hear the rest of this podcast, it is available to all Escape Collective members. And if you're not already a member, you can join up by visiting escapecollective.com/join. And from there, you will be an Escape Collective member. You will have all the perks of being an Escape Collective member, including the members only link to the rest of this podcast. You click that once, and from then on, every other week, the latest episode of Performance Process will drop into your podcast feed of choice, and you can listen happily.
Like magic.
Like magic. Like through aero clouds. Let's leave it there. Cut that bit out.